Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights, LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Shalom, Rabbi Yael HaKoyen Khan Olav Shalom, and it is in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz Le'edich Yomim V'Shonim Tevis for many long and healthy years. We are at the beginning of chapter 8 in Tanya, Perek Ches, and it's a continuation of the discussion about toxic behavior, essentially. Just like chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 discussed the healthy behavior of a human being, which manifests the divine soul within each one of us, and it manifests through our faculties, the 10 faculties that extend from that are part of and extend from the divine soul, and in thought, speech, and action, when your thoughts and speech and action are all dedicated to healthy behavior, healthy thoughts, healthy speech, and healthy actions, that brings divine healthy energy into this world and into your life. In chapters 6, 7, and now 8, he's speaking L'umazeh, there's the alter ego, the parallel universe of behavior that's not healthy. And when I say behavior, I mean thought, speech, and action, and the faculties. So there's an animal soul who's driven by egocentric interests, self-interest. And that animal soul has faculties as well, where the mind, Chabad, is not, instead of, as in the divine soul, focused on divine goals and transcendent goals, and not on selfish interest. Now the mind and the emotions are focused on self-interest. And it manifests in thought, speech, and action because faculties are faculties, but as long as it doesn't express itself in thought, speech, and action, it's still faculties within you. As we'll learn later, the difference between them. But essentially, faculties means your personality. That doesn't mean you have to think, speak, and act on it. But then, the three garments of the animal soul manifest in toxic, unhealthy behavior, meaning thoughts that are not good thoughts, speech that is not good speech, and actions that are not good actions. In that itself, we talked about two categories, Sholosh Klippas Atmeis and Klippas Nega. Sholosh Klippas Atmeis are truly poisonous, polluted, toxic behavior on all levels and should be avoided at all costs. Klippas Nega is Klippa. On its own, it's not Gedusha, meaning it's not completely dedicated to the divine, but it could go both directions. You could eat and sleep and do many things in this material world and direct it l'shem shamayim, like we spoke about eating for the strength to be able to serve God, or good food and the aroma of wine, which opens minds and sharpens your mind, or humor that opens the minds of the students, as we discussed in chapter 7. But it could also go in the other direction. And then temporarily, it's impacted by the Sholosh Klippas Atmeis, which is destructive. So it's neutral on its own, but it can go both directions. And fundamentally, really nothing is neutral. Because as long as it's not directed toward the right purpose, even if it's not directed in the opposite, it's already the beginning of something that is not aligned to the mission of your life. So when you look at a person, for example, that's completely focused, I'm not talking even a very secular example, completely focused on their business. And there's no room for wasting time. Everything is directed toward growing that business. Now in Kedusha, in Avodas Hashem, that would mean everything is directed toward fulfilling your mission, your divine mission in this world. That's the Nefesh HaLekis at work. Now, what's the Nefesh HaBamis? Where the focus is not on that mission, focus is on your own interests. Now, it could be in a milder way, just your interest without necessarily negative intentions, or it could be negative intentions, and even worse, you could be engaged in behavior that's completely antithetical to the divine. to godliness. Like he explained that Kedusha is everything that's bottle, that's aligned and committed and completely dedicated to the divine purpose. And Klippa is the opposite. And Klippa is Sitra Achra. On a level, on not an extreme level, it's not aligned to the divine, but it's not completely destructive either, or toxic. Shalosh Klipsat Meis is toxic. So we've been learning the different levels of all of this, both in chapter 7, well, it started with chapter 6 and chapter 7, and talked about how it affects and how you can cleanse from the toxins. La'asad love, in the future, there'll be a total cleansing, a total detox, so to speak, when Ruach HaTuma Avim min ha'aretz, and the spirit of toxins will be completely removed from this world, the impurities of the Shalosh Klipsat Meis and all Klippa, and the material world will be completely just like a shell that is protecting the fruit, aligned with the fruit and aligned with its mission. Bola Movis Lanetzach, that death and all the deathly forces of the negative energy will be completely swallowed up, completely disappear forever, or through tshuva. So tshuva has the capacity to detox someone. It's like cleaning something. Let's say something got dirty, or smudged, or in any way soiled. So there's a way of cleaning it. And cleaning it is through tshuva. And the different levels of tshuva, the most highest level of tshuva, ma'ava, that actually transforms toxicity and the zdeinus of deliberate sins. And sins really is essentially disalignment and misalignment from the divine purpose. But you can correct it when it brings you to a thirst and a passion that transforms that very essence. And then there's lower levels of tshuva, that different misalignments, different dissonance is addressed on different levels, as we learned in chapter 7. In chapter 8, he begins to discuss, continuing that theme, begins with Maicholas Asuras, because the two main toxic behavior that he's been addressing that is not aligned to God is Bias Asuras, illicit relations, and Maicholas Asuras, illicit or forbidden food, which is the word of Asur, kosher b'yidei achitzenim, which means it is bound, is being held hostage, it is trapped, it is locked and sealed. You can even say Asur from the word being bound, chained to the chitzenim, and you can't just extract it, except again through tshuva or l'asur lavi, when it will be extracted and transformed. And the same thing with tshuva. So now when a person tragically eats something that is in that category, basically like eating something poisonous, you can't just say, I'm eating it with good intention. Like we explained in the beginning of the chapter, and just summing up what we learned, you can't just say I did it with good intention, like he said. Why they call Isur Mepnei, even if you eat it, B'lo Heida, without knowing, meaning inadvertently. So just like he says, that you eat it inadvertently, a forbidden fruit, even for the sake of heaven, to use that food's energy to worship God, and even if he does it, not just intentions, and he prays, to study and pray with that energy that he ate from the forbidden food. So that chayes, that energy that you're gaining from the food, is not elevated and manifest in the words of Torah and Tefillah that are coming from the strength of that food, because the food itself is toxic. Just because you eat something that, if someone eats poison and it gives them strength to do something positive, it's still a toxic food. It's still a polluted food. It's contaminated. Not like heter. When heter means it's not bound, it's not chained. But here it is chained. And this indeed includes not just the Issa Daraisa, but also Issa Darabanan, as he explained. The Rabbanan, the sages, have the power to prohibit something, even though the Torah says it's not prohibited, because Chamurim Divrei Sofrim, they have a strength that's even stronger than, so to speak, the strength of Torah itself, of written Torah. And then finally, the last thing we learned, and the reason, and because it's toxic, that's why it has the power to cause a Yetzer Hara, the Nefesh Abamis, even though on its own it's Klippas Nega, as we learned. It's not Shalosh Klippas Atmeis. But this foreign force, this power of something that is toxic and something that is completely off limits, has the power, and that comes from Shade Meshedim Nuchrayin. It's not coming from the Nefesh Abamis itself, because Nefesh Abamis is Klippas Nega, like he says a line later. So here, there's a foreign force, what we call the foreign demons, that comes from Shalosh Klippas Atmeis, that's causing this person to be affected. Like we learned earlier, that when a person eats something, even kosher, and permitted, but they eat it for bad intentions, that are for selfish intentions or indulgence or negative results that come out of it, that you use the strength for negative things. So lefisha, temporarily, that energy enters into the world of Shalosh Klippas Atmeis. And that's why it has the impact that it can have an impact. Now, that's not the natural soul. The natural animal soul won't go there. But because there is such toxic energy in existence, and it's not something you can just say, I'll use it for good purposes, because it's objectively toxic and negative, that's why it affects the Yetzer Hara in that direction, from this negative energy. By contrast, the Yetzer Hara and the desire, the power of desire of the Yetzer Hara to things that are permitted in order to fulfill your desire, the person's desire, that comes from the so-called Jewish demons, Klippas Nega. Because it's mutter. What you're eating ultimately is not something that is not purely toxic. It's not purely dark. It's not purely poisonous. And as such, since it's mutter, meaning it's unchained, and you can even if you ate it for indulgent purposes, but you can then return it back because that energy doesn't belong to the domain of poison. Think of it like something that is not poisonous, a good food, but it was mixed for a while with something that was toxic or poisonous. So while it's mixed, it's in that category, but you can extract it, and since you can extract it, that's why it be reverted to holiness, like we learned earlier, and realigning itself with godliness. But now we're going to learn, which is a vital component, is this simple process like that you can behave in a way that is destructive. Let's say somebody hurts another person, just using an example like that. Can you just say, okay, I'll do tshuva, and I'll correct my ways, and I'll get forgiveness? Is there any lasting impact from that? Because remember, you did behave even for a moment in a way that was destructive. Now, the truth is, it's important to emphasize, because it's something we don't always think of. We think of when you hurt somebody else, you feel that that's a destructive behavior. You can hurt someone. And it could be a very long-term type of wound that you cause, psychological, emotional, physical. But we don't usually think of it in terms of ben adam lamokim, like here, eating something forbidden. We don't think, who are we damaging? But the truth is, it's the same type of toxic behavior. It's not affecting another human being directly because it's between you and God. But every Aveda, every sin, whether it's between man and man, between man and God, creates a misalignment between you and your purpose. And it's just important to emphasize. And in that sense, toxic behavior has affected you and affected the world around you. The question now is, what happens afterwards? So even if a person did something with wrong intentions, we're not talking about something that was forbidden. That we learned already. That cannot be purified until Mashiach comes, till the future, or through a very powerful tshuva ma'ava. And especially if it produces something like an illegitimate child, like we learned, or something that has something of permanence, you can't just change that. That's a reality that needs to be extracted, and only extreme levels of tshuva can do that. Or, as I said, the future, losid lavi, will be ruach hatuma avim min haaretz. But what about the behavior that temporarily you did something, like in this case, a person ate something kosher, but it was used for indulgent purposes, and for the temporarily it's been taxified, so to speak, by the Sholosh Klippos Atmeis, what happens afterwards? That's what he's going to address now. And he's going to address it in the context, number one, to understand the consequences of our behavior, and also how we ultimately get purified by it. So even though on one hand it can sound quite foreboding and frightening, because you're saying, one second, you're saying it lasts? Yeah, but the goal here is not that it lasts. The last that you could purify it. And he's going to talk about the different ways we can purify behavior. So there's ways we can do it through tshuva in this world, or through a certain particular type of avodah. But the Alter Rebbe is going to focus on the different types, what is called usually punishments. Now, I don't like to use that word because it's misunderstood. It's seen like a punishment, like a child in school doesn't behave well, so they get punished. In Torah, schar and einish, reward and punishment, is much better understood in context of cause and effect. When you put your hand in fire, the fire is not punishing you. It's the way of the world that a hand doesn't belong in fire. So there's a consequence. It will get burned, God forbid. Same thing with positive behavior. When you do something that's positive, you get reward. It means cause and effect. You treat someone nicely, there's an effect. It brings niceness to you and to the world. You put your hand in water to clean it, to refresh it, it has that effect. So instead of using reward and punishment, let's use cause and effect. So the next section is going to be about cause and effect in that way. And ultimately, every behavior of a person, thought, speech, and action, has consequences. So even if you correct it, he's going to talk about how it still leaves some impression, and we have to do something about it. So if you think about it with the right lens, with the right perspective, he's actually talking about something very positive. Now, if we actually never transgressed and nothing wrong was done in our lives, and we have no toxins and no pollutants and no negative behavior, nothing destructive, then that great. But we live in a world, like he said earlier, it's a world, Olam Hazeh, we said, a world that is Shekol Maisa Elam Hazeh, Koshim V'roim. We learned earlier in chapter 6. Mole Klippos V'sitra Achra, and all its paths and all its ways and affairs are difficult ones, are harsh ones, because of divine concealment. So that's a reality. So the question is, when we do interact, and we act, unfortunately, tragically, or sadly, as a result of this concealment, and don't follow and realign ourselves to God's purpose, but we go the other direction, so there are consequences. There's a cause and effect. But there's also a way to redeem it. So in addition to tshuva, there's things that happen after a person finishes their life in this world that he's going to discuss now. He's going to talk about 3 different things that help cleanse the neshama that has been in some way contaminated by behavior that was not aligned to its divine purpose. So let's read inside, and we're going to see that he's going to bring examples of how negative energy gets attached to both the body and soul of the person who acts on that negative energy, acts, speaks, or thinks, and he's going to talk about it in all 3 garments, starting from action, then moving to speech and to thought. That each of them, like we learned, these are 3 ways of manifesting. You can manifest divine energy when your thought, speech, and action is aligned toward the purpose of your existence, the divine purpose, or it can go the other direction and be polluted by behavior that is opposite, the destructive behavior. So he's going to give examples in each one of them, and he's going to begin with what he's discussing. We've been discussing forbidden foods, not permitted, non-kosher foods, so he's going to begin with that action. So here's what he says now. So though we just learned that the Yetzer Hara and Koyach HaMesaveh, to things that are permitted, is coming from so-called Jewish demons. It's negative energy, but it's klipas nega, what we call a Yiddish Yetzer Hara. It's not as gross and grotesque as something that's completely toxic and off limits, because you could bring a dak lefi sheyachal lachzeh l'kedusha, because it's heter. It's not completely bound and chained by the negative forces, so you could redeem it. Nevertheless, ach makol mokim kedem shechazel l'kedusha. So now he's going to explain, nevertheless, before it reverts to holiness, while you're involved in that behavior, a person's eating something kosher, but they're eating it in a very non-kosher way, meaning intention-wise, indulgence-wise, without the refinement, definitely not toward the sake of heaven. So before it is chazal l'gedusha, hu sitra achre v'klipa. It is powered now by the opposite energy, like we learned. It doesn't have to be something that's completely forbidden. The mere fact that it's not directed toward God, we learned already, is sitrach, is the other side. Like going back to the example I gave from the business person. As soon as someone in the business is not focused on what they should be doing, even if they're not doing anything destructive, they're already, in a way, creating a certain dissonance between what they're supposed to be doing. They're not doing it. And the same thing here. It's sitra achra because it's not directed toward godliness. Not carried out, not being fulfilled toward a transcendent higher purpose. And since it's that way, it has an impact. The question is, even when it reverts to Kedusha, he's going to say there's still a reshima that remains. That's the next line. So the first thing is, while that behavior has happened, something's happened. So when a person behaves in a way that's not appropriate, even if it's not something that's completely forbidden, there's something bad going on right now. Then he goes on, V'gam acher kach. So even though it's temporary, at the moment it's now in the domain of negative energy. V'gam acher kach, which means even after it goes back into the Kedusha, where you redirected it, because you've repented and you've figured out a way to take that energy, instead of indulging in it, you're now untying it, that temporary chain. Because remember, it's not usur, but it's temporarily in the domain of shalosh klipos atmeis. So even afterwards, harishimu mimenu nishar dovuk beguf. A trace of it remains attached to the body. A rishimu, a trace. So think of it like this. If a person eats a food that's not poisonous, but they eat it with poisonous intentions, or let's call it not poisonous intentions that are not for a holy and healthy purpose. So at the time right now, the food itself is kosher, is not poisonous, but the behavior around it has temporarily become connected to poisonous objectives, destructive objectives, or at least not holy objectives. Now you've corrected that, and since it's not poisonous food, it's not going to destroy you. It's not destructive in the fundamental sense that it will kill a person that poison does, because it's not poison. It was just directed and involved in poisonous activity, so to speak, toxic activity. So now when you redirect it, so think of the food, let's say healthy food got mixed in with something contaminated. This happens all the time. Contaminated food, and even good food gets contaminated by it. And then you figure out, and while it's contaminated, obviously the healthy food also becomes contaminated. But then you figure out how to extract it, how to separate it, how to separate the healthy from the unhealthy. So you throw out the toxic, you throw out the poison. But the food that you've extracted, is it purely, completely devoid of any of the impact of the toxins? No, not necessarily. Something could be clinging to it because it has polluted it to some extent. That's just a physical example. So he's saying that even when you extract it, there's still a trace that remains attached to the body. So even though now he's using the strength from that kosher food for praying or studying Torah, and therefore the energy of that food is now directed, but since it was even temporarily in the domain of the toxic domain of shalosh klipos atmeis, so he says, Lies kimekol meichel mashke nasa take of damu basar kipsare. That's the reason. Why is there a trace remaining? Because since the food and drink became the body's flesh and blood immediately. If it wasn't immediately, then you could say, you know what? maybe he wasn't toxified, it wasn't polluted. But since the person has that kosher food, the non-poisonous food has been mixed and immediately became involved and immersed with the poisonous, and in this case, that you've eaten that food has become part of your flesh, your blood, your flesh and blood, damu basar kibsare, and it happened right away. So you can't just say, okay, now I'm going to extract it. It's already become part of you when you used it for self-gratification for purposes that were not holy purposes. So even though now you're using the energy a minute later or a day later or whenever it may be toward positive ends, but you can't say that's not become part of your flesh and blood when it had negative intentions. In the example that I gave, that the food got mixed with something that's toxic. So it has some impact on it. And this has some similarity similar to what we read earlier in the end of chapter 7. What did he say? That if an illegitimate child is born from an illicit relation, something happened. You can't just say, I regret it. So in a subtle way, you could say similar here. Something happened because that the non-poisonous food has become mixed with the poisonous and became part of your flesh and blood. So therefore, a trace remains. And because of that, so he's now elaborating a bit more what he said in chapter 7. Therefore, since the body was a temporary home, it had become a temporary domain, a home, an environment for the negative shalosh klipos atmeis because of the non-positive intentions of eating that kosher food. So the body must undergo chibut hakever, which is a cleansing after death. Chibut hakever is essentially a type of like cleansing out, like when you shake out, let's say, a garment or a talis. That's a mashal, physical mashal for chibut hakever. Lenakese ulatayim metumose shekibel ba'anos elam hazeh v'tainugov, to cleanse and purify the body from its contamination, from kosher worldly pleasures and indulgences that came metumas klipas nega v'shedin yudoyin, that came from the impurity of klipas nega and Jewish demons. Because remember, we're talking about a Yetzer Hara that's coming from the animal soul, that's Jewish demons. But it was involved and contaminated by the toxic demons, by the negative demons and forces, the foreign ones that we spoke about earlier, the foreign demons. And since, even for a short while, that's what happened, you have to cleanse it out because the non-poisonous has touched the poisonous and it has in some way contaminated it. Okay, so we see here the effect of behavior is not something you can just ignore, it lasts. So this is not meant to depress us, it's meant to understand the consequences of behavior, but it also gives an explanation of what negative energy does in our lives. But also that ultimately it will be cleansed. Now, of course, if a person does tshuva, you could say they don't need chibut hakever. They won't need this type of cleansing because you can correct, even shalosh klipos atmeis can be transformed. Definitely klipas nega that has been temporarily trapped in the world of shalosh klipos atmeis. Okay. So we're now going to stop here and we'll continue next week. Everyone have a good tavach, and please check out TanyaApplied.com where you can find this and all previous episodes of Tanya Applied, as well as submit any questions you may have. Be well, and thank you so much.
This has been My Life Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.